pay attention more to efficiency enhancements. This is a higher level of education, higher education and training, of developing the market for labor and goods, creating an internal market for products, as well as the ability to engage in technology transfer. And then at the top here, we have a number of innovation and entrepreneurship conditions. These might be government policies and programs toward entrepreneurship. Finance that's more specific to entrepreneurship, like angel investing or venture capital. The commercial legal infrastructure for entrepreneurship is another one. We group the GEM economies into 3 levels of development. At the initial development level, we have what are called the factor-driven economies. These economies tend to have more entrepreneurs involved in agriculture, extractive businesses like mining and forestry. And the tendency is to focus on basic requirements because it does less good to focus on innovation and entrepreneurship factors if we don't have a communication or transportation infrastructure. In the development stage, we tend to have industrialization and more of a focus on larger companies. We tend to see entrepreneurship decline in the efficiency-driven stage, so it's typical that the efficiency-driven economies have a lower level of entrepreneurship. Although we do see that there is the opportunity to build up some supply chain businesses around the large companies that are starting up in this phase. Again, the focus is on the efficiency enhancers, so creating the labor and the market for products, as well as higher education and the other factors I just reviewed. Now, in the innovation-driven economies, competition is more based on knowledge and R&D, and we tend to see more service businesses in these economies. In the developed world, there are many alternatives for jobs, at least in a good economic situation. And so the focus tends to be on the entrepreneurship conditions that can try to stimulate people to start jobs. And whereas we might see in the factor-driven economies, more entrepreneurs are starting businesses out of necessity because the economy can't supply enough jobs, so people create their own jobs. In the innovation-driven economies, when there is a supply of jobs, we need to encourage those people that see opportunities to go out and start businesses. So we see the innovation and entrepreneurship factors as helping to stimulate entrepreneurship when it may be at otherwise a lower level. Here's an example of one factor that really correlates with growth entrepreneurship. Now, my co-author, Niels Bosma, did this plot of rule of law, and rule of law meaning the extent people believe in and abide by the rules of society. And he plotted it against improvement-driven opportunity. And these are the entrepreneurs that enter entrepreneurship because they see an opportunity, and they see also an opportunity to improve their lives through greater income or greater independence. Now, opportunity-driven entrepreneurship is often more associated with growth businesses, with innovation, and a higher level of internationalization. So it's important to pay attention to this when you are thinking about growth businesses in a society where they can contribute markedly to our job creation. So as you see here, the plot shows that as we are in economies with a greater rule of law, that we tend to have a higher level of improvement-driven opportunity. Now, taking a look at the 59 economies that participated in 2010, we've plotted them here against GDP per capita. As you can see, over to the left, we have a very high level of entrepreneurship. Again, it tends to be necessity-based entrepreneurship. And as we move to greater development levels, you see the rate of entrepreneurship start to decline. These are economies where jobs are starting to be supplied more by larger companies. And then we see a slight movement upward at the higher development levels, and these are nations where there's higher wealth to invest in businesses, as well as R&D and knowledge that can be leveraged for entrepreneurial activities. And just as a comparison, I plotted here only the necessity-based entrepreneurship. So remember, necessity-based entrepreneurs are those that are pushed into entrepreneurial activity because they need a job. They have no other options for work. as you see here, the decline on the left-hand side is very steep, and it continues to tail off to the right. And this just shows, when you look at this comparison, how important the opportunity-based entrepreneurship and how it plays a role as you move along the development line. And one of the key findings that we bring out, key policy implications, is that every economy needs to facilitate necessity-based entrepreneurship. It's not only important at the earlier development levels, like the factor-driven economies, but we also see that in this recessionary environment, we had a marked increase in necessity-based entrepreneurships in even the wealthier economies. We saw that in the United States, in Ireland, and in other economies of the development world. So it's important for a society to enable these necessity-based entrepreneurs to be able to start businesses. At the same time, people that see opportunities but are less inclined to start businesses, we need to encourage them to start businesses. So we need to encourage these opportunity-based businesses because they tend to be more associated with innovation, job creation, and higher growth. Now here I plotted startup versus established entrepreneurs, and just these red arrows point to some interesting things when you look across a few of these select countries. When you look to the left, Angola has a very high rate of startup entrepreneurship. But you notice in comparison, the level of established business is comparatively low. The concern we might have in this country is that there are a lot of people starting businesses, but many may not make it to the established phase. So we may be concerned with stability. We want entrepreneurs in the society to have their best chance to test ideas, okay, to maybe create these sustainable businesses out of the opportunities they see. For Malaysia, we have a higher level of established entrepreneurs and a lower level of startup entrepreneurs, and we might think more about dynamism and the ability to create new startups as well as keep the established businesses going. And as you see in the US, UK, we tend to see this balance of startup activity as well as established businesses. So one of the second findings, or the second policy implications, is that we need to ensure dynamism. We need to ensure that there's a turnover of new ideas. We want people to start businesses and possibly replace those that are no longer relevant in a changed market and industry environment. So dynamism as well as stability. Stability, as I mentioned, is where people have their best chance to start their businesses. If there are things that make it very difficult to stay in business, political factors, other environmental factors, then we don't really have the chance to benefit fully from these entrepreneurs. I think it was about 3 weeks ago, I had a news station, the national radio station in Colombia, called me and said, Colombia's number 3. We're number 3, and why is Vanuatu number 1? And Vanuatu is a small island of 200,000 people, and they had a very high rate of entrepreneurship. And I explained to them in Colombia that it's really important not to just look at the numbers of entrepreneurs. So even when we look at the Malaysia results, it's not just the number of entrepreneurs, but what is the quality of these entrepreneurs? What are these entrepreneurs doing? So Jen looks at insights that look a little bit more on just kind of a simple count of entrepreneurs. And one thing that we look at is the percentage of entrepreneurs with an international orientation. So this looks at how many of the entrepreneurs are having customers that are outside the country. You measure both having some customers outside the country as well as having more than 25% of our customers outside the country. Now, as you see at the lower development levels, we tend to have less internationalization. And this can be because some of the businesses tend to be more local in origin, whereas in the innovation-driven economies, we tend to have a high level of competition. And also, when we have knowledge-based businesses, there's a high development cost with R&D, and they can leverage it in other countries where these innovations might not have taken hold. So just a comparison of some of the internationalization data. As you see, Brazil and China, 2 of our BRIC countries, have very low level of internationalization. These are countries with big land mass, and especially in China's case, a huge population. I would be concerned with these countries in terms of other countries recognize this market, and they are getting a lot of players coming in and competing in these markets. And if we really want to develop, excuse me, our national comparative advantage, we need to think about internationalizing. Macedonia is one of the Eastern European countries that has a very high level of internationalization. And in this area of the world, you tend to have pretty permeable borders, a lot of free trade among these countries, and some were former states of larger countries. United States, again, is one of the countries that just has a high level of competition as well as high investments in R&D, so you tend to see a lot of internationalization there. I believe Malaysia was not in here because we had to pool data from multiple years, so next year we'll be able to report on that. Now, growth aspirations are key because this is what everybody is looking at in terms of job creation. We want not just more entrepreneurs, but more entrepreneurs that are creating growth businesses. So in Egypt actually Egypt's in the factor-driven economy, has the lowest level of entrepreneurship. So it has the lowest TEA rate, but as you can see, it has about a moderate growth ambition. So we tended to see in the MENA countries that even though the TEA rate, the entrepreneurship rate was low, more of these entrepreneurs are projecting high growth. Peru, on the other hand, has a lower growth rate. Peru is among one of the highest countries in entrepreneurship rate. And then Turkey is also another region, South Asia, Eastern European region that also we saw a high growth ambitions, even though the entrepreneurship rate is low. So one interesting pattern we had was that in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, we tended to have high entrepreneurial activity, but fewer entrepreneurs that were high growth entrepreneurs. Whereas the MENA and Eastern Europe region, we tended to have low entrepreneurial activity, but high growth expectations. So it just really emphasizes the importance of looking at the nature of entrepreneurship and not just the simple counts. Now, to the extent that a society excludes certain groups from entrepreneurship, that society doesn't benefit from, say, the energy and ideas from maybe women, youth, older people, other socially excluded populations. So we also look at different groups and their entrepreneurship rates. And here we have the economies ranked by level of female participation. And these are the factor-driven economies. As you see over to the left-hand side, the MENA countries tend to have a much lower rate of participation by women in entrepreneurship, whereas when you look in Africa, we have, and actually in the case of Ghana, more women than men entrepreneurs. So there can be lots of cultural reasons for this, also maybe out of necessity. In some economies, women tend to start businesses out of necessity. In the efficiency-driven economies, we start to see lower female participation in the Eastern European regions, where the reverse is true in Latin America. We start to see more women participating in the Latin American countries. And then in the innovation-driven, the wealthier economies, we have almost the largest variation. Korea actually has the lowest participation rate for women in entrepreneurship. It was a ratio of 1 woman for every man starting businesses. So it's the lowest ratio in the entire sample, whereas you see in Australia, we have equal numbers of women and men starting businesses. Also looking at the age distribution, we, in most economies, tend to have the 25 to 34-year-olds tend to be the most likely to start businesses. And that may make sense when you think that they have completed college, they may have a couple of years of work, so they have some ideas they can build on and experience. Especially in the innovation-driven economies, we tend to have fewer older people start businesses, especially in economies where there are pensions and retirement benefits. So here we see opportunities maybe to boost the amount of youth entrepreneurs in economies. And then looking at attitudes, the attitudes of a society toward entrepreneurship are important, not only because those that believe entrepreneur is a positive career choice, believe in entrepreneurship, are likely to start businesses, but they also depend on the general attitudes